So I've made a good few videos talking about the design of D&D up to this point, and the reason why I tend to focus so much on D&D is that, well, it is after all the most popular and well-known tabletop RPG in the world. So it's a pretty good point of reference even if you've never played a TTRPG before. But a common comment that I get whenever I point out some of the flaws with D&D is typically someone saying, "Well, you should try this other system that addresses that flaw." And you know what? I think it's about time that I started highlighting other games on this channel. And what better game to start off with than Lancer? Now, for those of you not in the know, Lancer is a tabletop RPG whose core fantasy is that each of the players gets to build and customize their own giant robot that you then use to fight other giant robots and giant robot level threats, and it is incredibly fun to play. Also, all of the player facing rules are available for free over on a website called CompCon, which I'll link in the description if you want to check out the game and some of its great artwork for yourself. But today, what I want to talk about more specifically is the way that the game handles its class system and progression. The way that classes are designed in a tabletop RPG is usually a pretty big deal. At their core, classes are basically guides that help players play out specific fantasies. If you want to be a frontline tank, you simply pick the barbarian class, and then most of the work is done for you. But the concept of classes themselves as a progression system kind of exists on a design spectrum. There are some games that have very rigid classes where once you pick a class, that is your character's main progression from the start to the end of the game. Pathfinder 2nd Edition, for example, has this sort of rigid class system where you're pretty much locked into your choice for the entire campaign. But then you have some games that are a little bit more flexible. You still progress through a class every time you level up, but you might have the option to do things like multi-classing, such as how in Pathfinder 1st Edition or in most versions of D&D, you can do things like instead of becoming a level 5 fighter, you stay as a level 4 fighter and then gain a level in rogue instead or something like that. But then, of course, you have games that don't have any kind of explicit class system. These sorts of classless games might still have common archetypes or something along those lines that most players will typically still fall into, but generally speaking, the way that you progress through the game and the way that you advance your character is a lot more freeform, with any character potentially being able to gain almost any ability in the game. For example, games like Shadowrun and the Warhammer 40k RPG Wrath and Glory are a lot closer to this style of design. Now, there's nothing wrong with these different approaches. I'm not saying that one is inherently better than the other. A more rigid class-based system can be much more easily balanced and tailor-made to provide a good experience, while a more free-form classless system can allow for a lot more player expression and fun with creating crazy combos. So the question then becomes, where does Lancer fall on this spectrum? Well, Lancer is kind of an interesting case that I don't think I've really seen before in the tabletop space. See, in Lancer, each class is represented by this long list of different licenses for different kinds of mechs. To give a really quick and dirty rundown of the setting for context, Lancer basically takes place thousands of years in the future in a virtually post-scarcity society. So you can basically 3D print almost anything that you could possibly want, kind of like a slightly less overpowered Star Trek replicator. The only thing stopping you from being able to create the biggest, baddest mech of all time is that you need to earn a license in order to get basically the STL files that you need in order to print those upgrades for your mech. So that's why levels in Lancer are called license levels, because every time you level up, you're literally earning the license that you need in order to print new equipment onto your mech. So let's take a look at these classes themselves. The first thing you might notice is that there is a lot of them. The core book alone has 4 different companies that have about 7 mech licenses each for a total of 28 different classes. That's quite a bit compared to games like D&D, which only has about a dozen. And then you can get that number up to 38 with just free first-party material on top of that. So that's a lot of different classes and mechs to pick from, but when you actually open up any of these given licenses, they only actually have 3 levels each. And that's where things get interesting, because the recommended level cap for this game is 12. The closest comparison I can think of is actually more like the job systems that you might see in a number of JRPGs, like some of the old Final Fantasies, or to use a more recent example, Metaphor, where instead of picking a single class and carrying it through to the end of the game, you're expected to learn and master multiple different classes over time, and then you can mix and match some of your abilities from all of the classes you've mastered together into your own distinct build. That's pretty much how it works in Lancer. In fact, the classes in this game do a lot more than just give you new abilities. You see, each class determines things like what weapons you can use, with most of them having some pretty interesting signature weapons that come with lots of fun secondary powers. And then on top of that, each class comes with a mech frame that you unlock at its second level. So the Baylor license unlocks the actual Baylor mech itself at level 2. The second Drake license unlocks the Drake, and etc, etc. These frames act as the basis for your mech and provide you with your basic stats and standard abilities. Again, kind of like how setting your job to a warrior class in a JRPG might adjust your base strength to be higher than normal. If you use the tanky Drake frame for your mech, it comes with a set of base stats and abilities that make you very durable regardless of whatever else you equip to it. You can only use one frame at a time, of course, but you can choose what frame you want to use and totally rebuild your mech from scratch from all of the licenses that you have access to tailor make it for whatever mission that you're about to go on. And you can adjust these stats as you level, of course, but generally speaking, each frame is clearly designed to be good at certain things and not so good at other things. So if you're doing a defense mission, you might use the tanky Drake mech that I mentioned, but if you might need to actually move and advance on an enemy, you might go for a more agile Blackbeard or Nelson frame for that mission. Things like that. But each frame still has weapon mounts and system points, which you can use to equip any of the weapons and systems that you have unlocked. So the real fun of the mech building aspect of the game is when you're able to level up multiple different classes and combine their abilities onto a single mech, which lets you pull off badass and or hilarious combos, like say putting the biggest super heavy weapons that you can find on a tiny size 1/2 mech and watching as it blows away mechs that are 5 times bigger than itself in a single shot. This is very different from things like, say, multi-classing in D&D. In that game, if you choose to do something like take a level of rogue when you're already a fighter, that means that you're essentially sacrificing that level of fighter in order to get those rogue abilities. But in Lancer, each class only has 3 levels, so by the time you reach level 6, you're actually forced to multi-class, and you can max out 2 different classes completely, and then start working on a third by the next time you level. You don't sacrifice anything to learn these extra classes. In fact, like I said, it's literally required that you do so, since you're taking more levels in general than the classes have to offer. But more generally speaking, from a design perspective, this micro class system or job system or whatever you want to call it, I think it actually solves a number of problems that can exist in many other tabletop RPGs. For one, the fact that each frame has a limited number of weapon mounts and system points helps keep the progression of the game a lot wider than it is tall. You can't equip literally every ability that you own from all of your classes at the same time. So, for example, you might have access to, say, 6 different really cool and powerful weapons, but if your mech only has 2 weapon mounts, then you can't use them all at the same time. So you're forced to pick and choose what you want to focus on for any particular mission, which means that you don't really get exponentially stronger as you level. Some of your numbers will go up, of course, but the real strength of a max level mech comes from the fact that you can customize it and really make it well suited to whatever mission you're going to take it on. But it still has that same limited number of weapon mounts and system points, so it's not going to be insanely more powerful than, say, a level 6 mech, or at the very least, it's not going to be as nearly as busted as, say, a level 20 character is in D&D or Pathfinder compared to like a level 10 character. And I think that this more horizontally oriented game design can be a lot better for handling game balance and creating encounters. After all, if you've ever DM'd for a high level D&D party, you know how insanely difficult it can be to balance encounters, especially in a completely homebrew game. So often you'll put together this insanely powerful encounter thinking that it's going to be this long, challenging, epic boss fight for your party, only to have them die in like 1 one or two turns. So then you ramp things up for the next fight, and then you accidentally cause a TPK because you went too far. Like, keeping the game's overall progression wider than it is tall helps prevent these kinds of issues from happening. Your mechs will get more powerful as you complete more licenses, but even a high-level mech might still have really low evasion or no real armor, like weaknesses that can be easily exploited, and you can only put so many weapons and systems on it at once, so it can be generally a lot easier to design and balance encounters without worrying about things becoming way too one-sided in either direction. But on top of that, the job system also solves a pretty significant problem with the design of many class-based games like D&D and Pathfinder that I don't think gets talked about enough, which is the fact that hardly anyone actually ever plays the highest levels in those games. I remember hearing a while ago that most D&D campaigns end before the players reach beyond, say, level 12 or so, but I couldn't quite track down the original source for that quote. So, just to test that hypothesis, I held a poll of my own, and needless to say, the results only confirmed my suspicions. I essentially asked my community what the highest level character that they've ever played was. Not the highest level that most of their campaigns end at, just the highest level that they have literally ever experienced even just once. And as of the time of this writing, a solid 80% of respondents have never experienced the highest levels of these games. Hell, a majority have only gotten to the mid levels, if that. So even though these games have so many cool high level spells and abilities and whatnot, the vast majority of players seemingly never experience them. Even going off of my own experiences, I've been playing tabletop RPGs and specifically D&D for well over a decade at this point, and even I have only gotten to level 18 a single time. Hell, even if we count Baldur's Gate 3, since it's a pretty faithful recreation of D&D, that game still only goes up to level 12. So the point that I'm trying to get at here is that many of these games essentially have way too many levels for their own good. If hardly anyone actually gets to experience levels 13 through 20, then they functionally don't exist for those players. Not to mention that most players consider the early levels before you unlock your subclass to basically be tutorial levels and often skip them, starting most campaigns at level 3 or even 5 sometimes. Meanwhile, with Lancer, because every class is only 3 levels long, you can get to the most powerful abilities in the game pretty quickly. So, if you want to play around with that really badass gigantic drill that can pierce the heavens, or use that weird techno NHP that can literally hack your opponents through the Egyptian underworld somehow, well, you can do it pretty early in the campaign. So yeah, I think that Lancer is a lot more economical in its design when it comes to these classes. You almost never run into a situation where the game ends and it was literally impossible for you to play with a certain ability, because no matter what, every ability in the game is theoretically attainable by level 3, and you can combine virtually any 2 abilities in the game by level 6, if not sooner. So even if you never play to levels 7 through 12 or whatever, you're not missing out on huge swaths of the game's content. Finally, I want to talk about 2 more common issues that I think Lancer's progression system deals with really well. The idea of dead levels, as well as the limits of player agency in class-based systems. Plus, this will give me an excuse to actually talk about Lancer's progression system a little bit more in depth. A common complaint with a number of tabletop RPGs, which admittedly is usually not as bad these days as it used to be in older systems, is the idea of dead levels. Essentially, it's the idea of a class level where you don't really get anything new or interesting to play with for that level. It's just kind of a go-between between the more interesting levels that you might get later on. This typically represents a level where like your attack bonus and your health will go up, and maybe a few other numbers on your character sheet increment ever so slightly, but you don't get any actually new abilities or feats or anything. You're functionally the same character you were on the previous level, just ever so slightly stronger. Unsurprisingly, this often plagues martial classes a lot more than magical ones, since most of the time as a mage, you at least are learning a new spell every level. For example, in Pathfinder 1st Edition, as a fighter, at levels 3 and 5, you just get armor and weapon training, which functionally just give you a +1 bonus to your AC and attack rolls, respectively. You don't get any actually interesting abilities or powers or anything like that. Your numbers just get slightly bigger. So those levels would be considered dead levels by most people. Most games are a lot better about this these days, but there are still some cases where you might have a level where the ability that you get is either a lot more niche or just generally less useful than most other abilities you get on other levels. But Lancer doesn't really have this problem because the levels are very condensed with content. As I mentioned already, Lancer only has 12 levels maximum compared to a typical D20 system's, well, 20 levels. But each level gets you a lot of things. Every single time you level up in Lancer, you get the following. First, you get to put a point in a stat of your choice between hull engineering systems and agility. These essentially act as modifiers to the base stats of whatever mech frame you're currently using. So if you put points in hull, then your health gets stronger than whatever the base health of that mech was. This is the most basic numbers go up style progression of the game, but it's still nice. In particular, I like that each stat actually gives you something both for every point that you put into it, as well as every second point that you put into it. So for example, with agility, every time you put a point into it, your mechs gain +1 evasion so that it's harder to get attacked. But for every 2 points you put into agility, you also gain +1 speed in addition to the evasion bonus. I just like that each stat does more than simply raise a single attribute of your mech. But of course, then the real meat of the level is the aforementioned mech licenses, and I think that every license level gets you something of pretty substantial value. As I mentioned, each license is only 3 levels long, so there's not a lot of room for dead levels to begin with. The first level of each license is the simplest, as you just get a couple of new toys to play with, but you're still getting new gear to equip to your mech, and this equipment can still be very impactful, like the Genghis's heavy flamethrower or the Gorgon's sentinel drone, just to name a couple. Then, the second level of each license is when you unlock the actual frame itself, so that's a pretty big deal, and you still get 2 more pieces of equipment on top of that. Finally, the third level, as I believe I've alluded to previously, is where all of the most powerful systems and weapons are, like the super heavy weapons and powerful NHPs. But on top of that, every 3 levels, you also get a core bonus, which essentially gives you a new passive that is applied to all of your mechs, which can range from things as simple as just adding +5 health or more armor to your mechs to things like making all of your mechs go up in a size category or being able to overcharge your mech's reactor more often. And what's great is that you get these core bonuses regardless of how you distributed your levels. So for example, you could just take 3 levels in a single license and call it a day, or you can split things up between multiple licenses across those 3 levels. For example, in my first campaign that I was playing, I was going down the Hydra license, which is a mech that's all about spawning drones. But when I looked at the 3rd license level for Hydra, I just didn't think that the weapon and drone that it gave me suited my particular build. So I took a level in Baylor instead to get the Hive drone. But that was still my 3rd level overall, so I was still able to get a core bonus on top of that. Finally, in addition to everything else I've talked about, you also get a talent every single level, which is basically this game's version of feats. You start out with 3 different talents at character creation at level 0, and then you gain another talent every single time you level. So you get a grand total of 15 talents by level 12, which I think is a far cry better than the 6 to 8 feats that you get in D&D by level 20. So yeah, to recap, every single time you get a new level, you're getting a new stat boost, you're getting new weapons and systems from whatever license level you're taking, and you get a new talent that gives you even more abilities on top of that, and every 2 levels, you can get an additional bonus from whatever stat that you're leveling up, and every 3 levels, you get a free core bonus on top of everything else. So yeah, I think that each level feels pretty impactful to me. Not once while playing this game have I ever felt like I didn't get a lot out of a particular level. And finally, there's the topic of player agency. The one big downside with the idea of a class-based RPG is that you often sacrifice a lot of control over your progression in order to simply take your class's next level instead. To use D&D as a punching bag one more time, especially when it comes to martial classes, you're often not making many choices at all throughout your career. If you take the Barbarian, for example, once you pick your subclass, you're pretty much locked into your progression from that point on. The only real choices that you make and what abilities you gain past level 3 is when you gain a new feat, and that only happens once every 4 levels. So for the other 3 intervening levels, you're just kind of following the progression that has been laid out for you. Now, this isn't necessarily a bad thing, I guess. After all, a straightforward progression system can make a game very intuitive and easy to learn, so D&D probably owes a lot of its popularity to this fact. Plus, obviously, you still get to make moment-to-moment choices for things like what weapons and gear you want to have your character using, though that can of course vary from game to game. Meanwhile, as I think I've demonstrated with my breakdown for Lancer, you get to make tons of choices every single time you level. What stat do you upgrade? What talent do you take? What license level do you want? And yeah, sure, you can focus on upgrading a single talent or a single license for a while and have a fairly linear progression for those levels, but because each license is only 3 levels long, that means that at most you're only going to go 2 levels before you have to make another major decision again. And since the game encourages multi-classing so much, every time I take a level in Lancer, I feel like I'm making a choice between whether I want to continue my current class or swap to another one. Compare this again to D&D, where yes, it is true that multi-classing does exist, so in theory that Barbarian I mentioned earlier is making a choice between whether they stay a Barbarian or start multi-classing every single time they level up. But as I've mentioned already, the game also kind of heavily discourages you from multi-classing by providing you with many downsides and trade-offs. So while you could make the argument that every level similarly has a choice between, like I said, leveling your current class and multi-classing into a new one, the choice is much more discouraged in games like D&D compared to Lancer. And I think that Lancer strikes a really good balance between providing the players with structure for their progression that helps clearly outline certain fantasies to help them build the mech of their dreams, while still providing a lot of room for players to make choices in how they level up their mechs so that their robot really feels like their own custom creation. So yeah, I think I've rambled on for more than long enough about Lancer for today. I just really love this game system, and I hope to keep playing it for years to come, because it is a great experience all around. And if you enjoy the idea of picking up a game that is all about building your own customized robots and punching other robots with them, I highly encourage you to check it out as well. If I had to give the game one criticism, it is that the game is very specifically focused on the whole mecha action combat aspect, and provides very little focus on really kinda anything else. Like, there are skills that you can put points into for social checks as well, which I am just now realizing I totally forgot to mention earlier when I was talking about the progression system, but there's also a pretty good reason for why I forgot to talk about them, because like I said, it's really not the game's forte. You sit down at a table to get into a giant mecha action battle, and that's pretty much it. But I still love it for what it is. And as always, I'm happy to continue the conversation in the comments down below. By all means, if any of you have all played Lancer yourselves, I'd love to hear your stories in the comments. And if you know of any other games that have some notable progression systems like this, for good or for ill, I'd love to talk about those as well. And if you liked what you saw and want to see me make more videos like this about Lancer or whatever other topics you want to see, then make sure to leave me a like and subscribe. And if you really want to support the channel, there is a link to my Ko-Fi in the description down below. But for now, thank you all for watching, and I hope to see you all in the next one.